Um, so I've got a little presentation of mostly a lot of photos, a couple little videos that'll kind of take you guys through my journey of getting into wood sculpting. I feel like I still consider myself more of a sculptor than like a true woodworker because I come from like an art background and found my way into wood. So I'll talk a little bit about that. It was almost like a reverse process where I feel like I'm working now into becoming a woodworker, like learning all the proper techniques. So I'll talk about that a little bit. And then I'll finish with like some of the newer work I've been making and like how I've been integrating some newer like new age technology with like traditional woodworking techniques to create my sculptures. A little bit about myself. I'm originally from Newcastle, Pennsylvania, which is like far west side of Pennsylvania, towards Pittsburgh. And I've been living in Rhode Island for about 7 years now. I came here in 2018 to teach art at St. George's down in Middletown. So I taught there for 4 years and then left that job to venture out and set up my own studio, wood shop. So I'm just on like the west side of Providence is where my studio is, kind of like near like the steel yard, like in those mill buildings over there. Um, and I work in my studio part-time, and then I'm also a studio assistant for a woman named Tracy Glover, who is a glass blown like designer artist up in Pawtucket. So I do a lot of like metal finishing and like assembly in her studio. um so I would say I first started getting into woodworking halfway through my undergrad in college. I went to Westminster College out in Pennsylvania, not like 15 minutes from where I grew up. Um, I would say I dabbled in wood a little bit. Like growing up, my dad was always like a self-taught handyman, always fixing things around the house. And then I'm an Eagle Scout, so I went from Cub Scouts all the way through, became Eagle Scout. So I feel like always like being out in the woods, learning how to like whittle sticks and stuff. So I feel like it was in me a little bit as a kid. And then really found me in undergrad when I was studying art at Westminster College. Um, I took a sculpture class and we were studying some like contemporary sculptors, and one that really like stuck with me was this guy named Martin Purrier, who's an American artist, and he was creating these kind of like stack laminated curved forms, and I was really intrigued and like didn't understand how he was getting those curved forms. This was in like 2012, 2013. So the internet obviously existed, but like things like Instagram and like all the video sharing, YouTube existed, but there weren't as much content on like woodworking or sculpting or really any of that. So even he didn't really have many videos of his process. So just working, trying to like reverse engineer his process using belt sanders, and I didn't even know what a die or an angle grinder was at that point either, which I later found out was like my best friend in trying to figure out these curves. Just using like palm sanders and belt sanders, I was trying to like practice and figure out how he was making these forms. Um, and and at the same time, I was looking at like visiting other art museums and really getting into sculpture. And this guy, Henrique Oliveira, who's from Brazil, really intrigued me. He was working differently than Martin Purrier, where he's the laminate or he's using like really thin like construction plywood that I guess is very prevalent in like the streets of Brazil. And he creates these really like organic, like large installations and forms. So he was kind of always in like the back of my mind when I was like trying to figure out my own sculptural process. And then this was the very first wood sculpture I had ever made in that undergrad class, inspired by Martin Purrier. And it was completely made by just using belt sanders, palm sanders, and like rasps. Um, and I was excited because I was starting to get those like curved forms that I was really interested in. So I kept like this process just like completely drew me in. I was like sucked into like I want to like explore what else I can make out of wood. Um, so that was the first piece I ever made, and I came across this artist, Japanese artist named Hiroshi. And at this point, like I said, Instagram was starting to become a thing and artists were starting to use it pretty heavily. And I found him on Instagram, and he was posting a lot of behind the scenes videos, photos of how he was making his stuff in the studio. And that's what led me to like figuring out like, oh, he's using an angle grinder with like a sanding disc on it to like really take a lot of the wood off. Um, and he's really unique because now I feel like it's prevalent to see like a lot of people reusing old broken skateboards, but I think he is the first one to have like really done it and done it well. So these are a few of his sculptures here. Um, and he really inspired me too in figuring out more of that lamination technique and just more experimentation and just really showing like what the possibilities are of with wood sculpting. Uh, so in trying to figure out my own sort of sculptural language and what I wanted to make, I was always intrigued by like geological forms, like rock formations, caves. Again, a lot of that coming back, I think, from like my days in being in the Boy Scouts. Did a lot of like exploring like caves and just spending a lot of time out in nature. Um, and I really like this the how like geodes and caves and things. There's this kind of interior exterior relationship happening. So I wanted to try and like use that as a jumping off point to start to figure out what I wanted to make, how I could translate those ideas into like wood sculptures. So while I was still an undergrad, this was like my senior year of college, I started making these two pieces as just like kind of an independent project in my senior year. And trying to figure out like being inspired again by like geodes where you have that more geometrical kind of like growth interior and then more like organic kind of smooth exterior. So at the time I thought these were like really successful in figuring out like, oh, this is maybe a direction I want to go in. But again, like still didn't know much about tools. I didn't even use like the school didn't even have a table saw. Like, oh, that's another thing. The art studios there were very primitive. It was just a small liberal arts college. So I was very limited by my tools. Um, there was just a chop saw and there wasn't even a bandsaw. It was like a chop saw, a belt sander, and some hand tools, I think. So early on, I think having those like strict limitations also really helped me just to like problem solve and get really creative and try to figure out how to bring these ideas I had to life. Um, so these ones I did at this point figure out the angle grinder though, so I was able to get the curves and not rely on just a belt sander, palm sander, and some rasps. Um, so then I graduated and moved back home because my mom unfortunately got sick, so I just moved back home to help like take care of her and help my dad out. And at that time, I kept making some art and trying to enter art shows and add to my portfolio. And that's when I came across Wendell Castle, which I'm sure some of you are familiar with Wendell Castle, how legendary he is. And I saw this piece at the Cleveland Art Museum when I was just taking a trip over there. I think I got into a show in Cleveland, decided to check out the museum, and I stumbled upon this desk and it just like clicked. I was like, this is the guy I need to like research and figure out. He's in like the same mindset and he's obviously got it figured out to make these really amazing pieces of furniture. So discovering him was really helpful and learning some more processes. Um, and so this was the first sculpture I'd made outside of college, and it was starting to push. I feel like I was moving more into that kind of geode form. There's like forms inspired by nature, and it was really kind of one of my teachers, a philosophy professor from undergrad, commissioned me to make a piece, and he didn't care like what the piece was. He just wanted me to like make whatever I wanted. So it really gave me a jumping off point to experiment and try this process out. Um, and so that was like a really crucial moment in sort of my journey into getting into this type of sculpture. And then I made the second version for another friend of mine who's a tattoo artist. This one I had stained the outside of it and just wasn't happy with like how the stain turned out. So like all these moments when I was going through these photos, I was like, oh, that was the moment where I realized like, oh, I want to avoid stain and just focus on like I started to learn about different species of wood and how they have like natural colors and started to pair those together. So that was a neat little moment to revisit as I was putting this presentation together. Um, so once I got into it, I just got like completely sucked in. And like I said, I'd moved back home with my parents. I didn't really have a studio space. and I had just like my dad's tools and like some other tools I was able to buy, working a part-time job. So this is a picture on the left of like a table I built in my parents' like downstairs basement to like work on. And then this was a tent that I sewed together with my grandmother's sewing machine out of tarps so I could like power carve in my dad's garage and try and keep the dust contained. Because it was Western Pennsylvania, so I was like working during the winter. But I was like I couldn't stop, and I like wanted to keep building my portfolio to eventually go off to graduate school and like get into more art shows. So this was kind of the solution to keep my dad happy, and keep the dust contained somewhat. And then eventually I was able to get this small little art studio. I found like a building that was it used to be an old like bait and tobacco shop, and it was just kind of I think that this part of the building was somewhat just like left as was, and then the owner of the building had like started making the upstairs into an apartment, and eventually was going to turn this into an apartment, but then just never got to it. So he's like, I'll rent it to you. It was $200 a month, which was crazy cheap, and I was like, I'll take it. And I was able to just like turn it into my first ever art studio, and started just like experimenting more, making more like larger sculptures. And I was able to work with a lot of like scrap cutoffs. I found that there was a large family owned, like massive mill near like in Ohio, so not too far from where I grew up, about a 30-minute drive. And they'd expanded from not only just milling logs, but they'll kind of make anything, doors, full staircases, whatever you want, the full shop cabinets, kitchens. And they would sell these cutoffs by like the pallet for $50 for like a full stack pallet. And that was like a gold mine for me at this point. So it allowed me to start working with more um, higher end like hardwoods without having to shell out all the money. And it allowed me to experiment more. Um, so I started making, again, just kind of growing the scale of these sculptures. This piece turned out as a sculpture at first, and then I eventually realized I could make a nice coffee table. Um, so it turned out like this was the finished piece here, and then I eventually got like a glass top for it. So that kind of also like worked into I was making just purely sculpture stuff, but then I was like maybe these could also become like furniture pieces as well. Um, so and then that sparked my interest in making kind of like this little end table, just kind of pushing again what I could do with like laminating all these pieces of wood together. And then I also realized like, oh, I can maybe try and make these into other types of objects as well, so things that would be like sellable to help me pay rent and buy more materials. So I quickly realized like, oh, I can make some like wall shelves out of these. So it was at this time where I kind of felt like I was starting to build my own world with this technique of using all these scrap cutoffs and this lamination technique. And I just couldn't let it go. I just kept making anything and everything I could. So this was some shelves I would make. Um, Another sculpture here that was I felt this one I was really starting to use the different colors of wood. It's all poplar, but I started saving all like the dark like purple and like black striations that you can find in poplar wood, to kind of to play with the color and just the natural grain of the wood. And then these are some larger pieces here. Again, playing with color where like I was mixing some red oak on the bottom here with like maple at the top to create like a striation effect of the change of color. And then this is I started playing with some light as well, like created like custom bases to light the inside of that sculpture there. So that's kind of the interior of the sculpture on the right. And then also was like pushing the sculptures and figuring out like, oh, maybe they could hang on a wall as well. So just again, experimenting with everything and anything you could possibly think of as a sculpture.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Do you have a name for what you call this innovation of compounding bits and pieces together?
I call it like block stack lamination because it's like just from like stack laminations usually just like gluing boards together, but I'm like taking a step further. It's almost kind of similar to like making a cutting board in some sense of like those blocks, cutting and gluing the strips back together. Um, and then in 2016, I went off to graduate school just to get my MFA at the Maryland Institute College of Art down in Baltimore. And I went into grad school like wanting to continue to experiment with wood, but then when I was there, I was in a multidisciplinary program, which means you can kind of do anything. Like there were people that were painting, there were people making video art, doing drawings, like sculpture, everything and anything you can think of. So I did this one wood piece and incorporated some string into it. Um, but then realized like, well, I'm in graduate school, so I want to be here and like absorb anything and everything I could. So I did dabble a little bit of wood right at the beginning. I made this large piece where I like was pouring plaster. I kind of made a giant geode. This was one giant thing, and I drilled like a hole in it and poured plaster into it, spun it around, and then like chopped it open. Um, just trying to experiment. I didn't really end up liking the result of it all, but it was a fun learning experience. Um, but while I was in grad school, I was also starting to learn like 3D modeling and a lot of more of these like new age technologies that were kind of lying in the background for me. I didn't really know how they were going to apply to my interest in wood sculpting, but they came about later. And then in 2017, so the summer in between my 2 years of grad school, I went to an artist residency in out in it's right near Lake Tahoe, South Lake Tahoe in Nevada, called the Buffalo Creek Arts Center. And there I went back and started making my time there. I made like a really large concrete sculpture. And then I made these two wood sculptures that were there. And again, it was a nice like it kind of almost brought me back in because I was right in the middle of my 2 years of grad school and I missed working with wood. So I was like, oh, this is an opportunity to like get back into it a little bit more. And again, experiment with like pairing different species of wood to just play with the colors. So this was I think some poplar, maple, and walnut mixed together. And then after graduate school, I mentioned I moved to Rhode Island in 2018 to start teaching art at St. George's School. And this is a small sculpture. It's about the size of like one of these ones I have up on the table here. It was the first thing I made when I moved to Rhode Island. Um, and up until this whole point, I was figuring out like the overall shapes of these sculptures. I would sketch them out on just pieces of paper and then have to figure out like I would build them in layers. So I'm sketching out like roughly every single layer, leaving it up to like, to work intuitively or leave it up to chance a little bit as I was trying to figure out the layers, but it was very time consuming trying to draw out every layer. And then I would glue all the blocks together, cut it out on a bandsaw, figure out the next layer, and then glue all those layers together, and then carve the outside and sand it. Um, and it was in this moment where I realized that I can start using some of those 3D modeling techniques that I learned in grad school, and I'd gotten better at them. The software's gotten easier to use. So I started figuring out like, oh, maybe I can lay out these sculptures on a computer first, and I can see them in like 3 dimensions, and that will help me like determine more of the shapes of the layers. I still was like bandsawing them, but I was able to create more complex shapes. So this is a picture of the sculpture I have up here. You guys come check it out after the talk. But it's kind of like based on like vertebrae bones that I kind of doubled. So you could see it kind of like is like a shape of a vertebrae. So I wanted them to seem like um, almost like found objects or like this found bone or something you find on the beach or like in the woods. But it was suggesting a bone, but not necessarily anything specific or specific to a certain animal. Um, and again, still playing on that kind of like geological um, interior exterior relationship that I was interested at the beginning of my sculptural journey. And this is another version here of the other one I have up on the table. Again, this is another like vertebrae-ish type shape that I was like just abstracting to create almost like a bone form. This is another one here. And then as I was working through these, I've still kind of felt lost as far as like, well, what's like, I'm interested in creating these objects, these sculptures, but I think I'm moving more into like I want to build like a whole world, like a language for this type of work that I'm doing. Um, and I was already like making some furniture back in the past. Now I'm making these new objects, and I said thinking about like how do I build like a full environment? And I went back to like making these wall shelves, kind of inspired by those earlier ones that I was doing before I went to grad school, and just kind of pushing the limits of them again. Of creating these like almost like cave-like or stalactite like pieces of furniture. So I started making these wall shelves, which kind of like took me in a new direction. Um, and really started like playing around in these 3D modeling apps. So these two here, this top one's called Nomad Sculpt, and then the bottom one is Shaper 3D. And I realized like the top one, it's very intuitive. Like I can use an iPad to do it, and it's almost like you're sculpting with like a ball of clay on a screen, which felt like very natural to me. Before, I was never good at like using a mouse to try and like sculpt things on a computer. It was too clunky. So now with the newer technology, it feels more like you're just working with your hand almost. And then the bottom app, the Shaper 3D, I realized like I could combine the two apps, make something in the Nomad Sculpt app, and then import it to the Shaper 3D app to get more precise dimensions. So I could really scale these things up, which pushed me further into making larger like furniture pieces. So this image on the right is the 3D model of a sculptural table that I eventually made. And this was just like a big aha moment for me because it's kind of everything I was like searching for because I do like technology and computers, but it still would frustrate me and I just would want to go work with my hands again, which I'm sure you guys can all attest to being woodworkers. We all like making things in real life. But this felt like the closest thing to it, and now I found like a bridge between the two. So this is the table that I was able to make from that 3D model, and the again, I still am like doing all the hand carving and everything, but it really just helps me figure out these layers. This is a great representation of how what I'm talking about with the layers. I'm gluing it together just like Wendell Castle was with the stack lamination. But I would like bandsaw them out to get the rough shapes because it's not starting out as like one big block. I want to try and get as close to the shape to save me time in carving. And in this moment, I realized I had also started being able to use CNC machining um, to help me cut those shapes out, which speeds the process up a lot, as you can imagine. Like instead of bandsawing every single one of those layers, now I have a small CNC machine that'll help me cut them out. So that introduction of that technology has also allowed me to like kind of speed up this process and like work a little bit larger. This is a 3D model for like another small table that I made. Um, and it's also like it's nice you could see these voids that I leave. That's kind of where those blocks go that I'm able to like kind of map that out ahead of time. But again, but with these ones, when I was doing it on paper, I would sketch on the paper like, oh, leave this area for some blocks, which you can imagine would be like very time consuming. So the 3D modeling really helps speed that up as well. So this is oh, there's a video here of this is the table piece. You can see all the layers. I still need to carve them off with like the angle grinder and then do a lot of sanding, as you guys can imagine.
What type of timeline does a piece like this?
This one probably like maybe 80 to 100 hours or so.
It? Okay,
Yeah.
that's not much at all. Really?
That's like 5 battery boxes.
This is ash wood.
We did wait when you were done.
This one I ended up making it hollow, so it's still pretty heavy, but thankfully it's not like a solid block. But I just bought a scale to go to weigh them, so I don't know the exact weights of them. Um,
What kind of glue did you use?
I'm using like a white Type Bond glue that I found that it helps like when it squeezes out, I don't have to deal with the yellowing as much.
You said you swore off stain in your early years, and
Yeah.
that's interesting, but it means a lot, but it also means nothing in the other sense, because there's so many things like shellac
Yeah.
that change the color.
That changed. Yeah.
Stain really. So what is your finish?
So I'm just using a tung oil finish on them.
Okay, so something that soaks in but doesn't leave a film.
Yeah. And I think what I didn't like about the stain was I think because there's so many seams and like joints with this, it just like highlighted them too much, or like I had to be even more particular with the sanding. And I just like the working with the natural color of the glue. And then this is a video of like the process of me like hand gluing every single one of the little blocks in. Um, and once I got to making these larger pieces, I realized too there's like almost something like architectural about them that I like. Like now that they're on a bigger scale, they almost feel like they could be like there's like a small little city, and like the furniture pieces like a landscape or something. I like that there's like a kind of like macro micro kind of scale going on. And this is that piece there finished up. And then this is a chair that I made. This one it's probably the most time consuming one. I'd say it's probably close to 200 hours maybe on this chair, but I made the 3D model on the left there, and then the right is the finished piece. Some of you guys saw it at the fine furnishing show. I think it was a video. Oh yeah, this is me carving it. And I've also too, I have to figure out a lot of the times like the 3D modeling really helps and give me an idea of like when I have to plan these out, sometimes I have to think ahead of, are my tools going to fit in these areas? Do I have to sand areas first? So you'll see in this video, this bottom part, a lot of it's carved, and then I'm gluing the other parts up and carving those. And I'm trying to like think ahead of like, all right, if I glue these pieces on, then are my tools going to fit in there? Am I going to have to? I'm basically trying to figure out the easiest way to make sure all my sanding tools fit in certain areas, so I don't have to do as much hand sanding in the really tight spaces. And then this is just like a little side table I made that kind of inspired by like stalactites or stalagmites, like kind of a cave-like form. And that's like the 3D model on the left side there.
The 3D model is just an image, right? It's not a 3D printed, or is it printed?
I could 3D print it if I wanted to, because it's like a full when I could pull one up on my laptop and show you. You can kind of spin it around and see all angles of it. Which, like I said, that was like really helpful in creating these more intricate things, because before I was trying to sketch on paper all the different angles and like trying to imagine what it is. But the technology is amazing, that like, and it's so intuitive and like easier to use now. It's a lot less clunky than it used to be. This is another little like just kind of like a little drink table that I made. And then this is a mirror with the 3D model on the left. And then this is I think this is like the first light I made too, like a little like wall sconce. again, I was just kind of thinking, what other objects could I like make from this technique that I'd figured out? And I think what I'm working towards now is like my dream would be like I'm trying to work like eventually get like gallery representations to start trying to work with like larger galleries and maybe do like a solo show somewhere. But my dream would be to have like a museum show where it's almost like an environment of all these like different types of furniture, sculpture, maybe some lights on the wall. That kind of feels like you've like entered into like another world. And then I've also been it kind of like circles all the way back again too of like, okay, these objects like these sculptures, they take a lot of time. I have sold a couple of them, but you got to find like collectors and work with galleries and things like that. So it doesn't happen as fast. So I was like, how do I pay for my studio and like make this thing fund itself? And I figured out like I could start making bowls and like dishes and other like smaller objects in this similar style. So it still has that very like organic kind of like natural feel to it. And I've been able to figure out how to use that kind of block lamination technique to kind of tie it to my sculptural pieces. So this is like a bowl. It kind of reminded me of like a lotus flower or something. So it's got like a little dish underneath in the bowl up top. And this was a mirror that I made. I haven't made one like this since. It's been a few years, but I really liked um, instead of just using one solid piece of a mirror, I ended up getting like little squares of different shapes that were already like pre-cut to kind of add to that like block, like wooden block texture that the rest of the sculpture had. And it's obviously purely more like a sculptural mirror. It does function and it's kind of cool because it like distorts your image and creates like small little it's kind of unique when you stand in front of it. I kind of want to keep experimenting with that some more too, just because of the effect of it. And I kind of want to see what happens if I were to like pair light with it too, like if the shadows or like the reflected light coming off all the little square mirrors. So that might be like a new direction I'll go in sometime soon. And I made some like candlesticks. Um, and then recently, the most recent piece I made was a lamp that was purely sculptural. And this is like the 3D model here. A couple different views of it. So it's the first time I had that wall sconce, but that was pretty easy. I had just bought like a kit that like I could put the light in. But this one was the first one where I had to think through like the lampshade, how the light fixture was going to work, how you can kind of like wire it up through. So again, creating the 3D model for it was really helpful in like laying all the dimensions out when I made it. Um, and I also realized the most recent thing is integrating VR or virtual reality into my sculpting and like woodworking process. So there's like VR headsets. Again, the technology is like getting better, more user friendly. And I realized like these 3D models can work in VR as well, almost like a video game. So this little video on the left shows the 3D model in like a in a VR headset. I could kind of sculpt it, like play with it. So yeah, that's a good example of how you spin the model all the way around. And then this is pretty crazy technology. It's called so VR is virtual reality. AR is augmented reality. So this video over here is this 3D model, and on my iPad, you could use this app to kind of place the 3D model like on the table. So it's when you're looking through the iPad, it's as if the thing is sitting there on the table, but it's not in real life. So this is that real life table that I made, but then the lamp is just sitting on there like virtually. It's pretty crazy how well it actually like works, and you can like walk around it and it's like it's there. Um, so it's been fun playing with all that technology to try and figure out the overall shape of the my sculptures. Let's see. Let's do the rest of the video. And then this is how the lamp turned out when I actually carved it. And then, so leading up to like now, this is like the newest project I'm working on. So it's going to be like a bookshelf that's kind of sculptural. So this is the 3D model I made of it. And I've been playing around with it in on the 3D modeling apps and in VR. And I've been able to recently figure out how to take a photo of some of the wood that I've glued together in that block lamination technique and use a piece of software to actually apply that to it, so it looks as real as it possibly could as far as like what it's going to look like in real life. So I like that this technology too will help me as I'm trying to like talk to galleries, or like if I get a commission piece, I can almost design what the piece is going to look like digitally, and then I've figured out the way to take that model and make it come to life in real life. So it's nice that it's come full circle for me. And this last video is a little video of like a VR space that I put my work in. So this is all just like digitally rendered that you can kind of like experience with like a VR headset. So there's like the lamp, this table, or the set of shelves that I made with like some objects, some of the bowls that I made, just some other like random objects that I put on there. And then there's the chair on the left there. And I think we're with all this technology, and then like with woodworking, I've been thinking a lot about, you know, our current, like where we are with technology. It feels like it's consuming everything. And like with 3D printing, and now there's like carving robots. I think as an artist and just a maker and a woodworker, I feel like sometimes there's always like fear of like, oh, eventually there's carving robots that will just like make anything you want. And it kind of takes away from like, what's the point of like learning all these skills anymore? And I think with my process and like utilizing this new technology and creating these sculptures, I think there's always going to be, even though you can use this technology to make new things, I think in the end, like adding your hand touch to it, like still carving it, like even though I'm using a lot of technology to create these things, I'm still having to hand carve it. And I leave, even if I make the model on the computer, when I'm carving it in real life, I do make alterations to it, and still like ultimately everything's done in person. So that's something I've just been investigating myself, is like as these new technologies come about, I feel like there's still always going to be that demand for the handmade, or at least I'm going to keep pushing for it. Because I feel like, eventually like they do have carving robots that will carve stuff. They'll take those 3D models, and like there's like robotic arms that will carve stuff as like close as possible. But I feel like at some point, if that becomes ubiquitous, everything's going to be like still boring and the same. You're still going to need like, I feel like we're going to just miss that like handmade human element to it. So I think that's something else I want to continue to explore and push with my own work, is just like, it's great to embrace these technologies, but like the traditional, techniques and like working with your hands is still, I think, always going to be the most valuable when we create these objects, whether they're utilitarian objects or just purely sculptural objects or furniture objects. But that's my presentation, and I'll open it up to questions, and feel free to come up and check out the couple small sculptures I have here. And thank you guys for having me. Yeah.
Wow.
Steve, this is maybe just my 73-year-old eyes speaking, but looking at some of your earlier things, the geo things with all the little blots inside,
Yeah.
I had this sort of feeling of pixelation.
Yeah.
So things were out of focus.
Yeah. So that's actually, I'm glad you brought that up, because it does feel like pixelated too, which that's something else I like, because even though I didn't start out using much technology with my work, now I am. And it almost has that feeling of like bridging that gap between like the real world, this very natural material, it's all wood, and something that feels like digital. So I like that kind of comes through. It's almost, like I said, going back to like, I want to create like almost like a fictional world, like these things exist in this space in between like our real world and like the digital world type of thing.
So are you completely wedded to wood? But, you know, so for example, the pen turners here, they could pick up all these weird colorful, unique acrylic blocks.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I haven't really used acrylic much at all. I've thought about it for like ways I could incorporate it. So it might come into my work at some point. I've been thinking about how I can incorporate some other materials as well. I'm also thinking now that I'm starting to get into more furniture, I kind of want to make a cabinet, like some sort of sculptural cabinet. So I've been thinking through how I can use like make my own hardware for it, like maybe some cast brass hardware or something that's kind of sculptural too. So even though I've been like everything's been all wood, I think I am starting to get the itch to like incorporate some other materials as well. Yeah.
I'm glad he said that first, because I was thinking also, something like the Japanese kintsugi.
Oh yeah.
Would be a beautiful thing to introduce, and I was wondering if you had ever thought about having even like some areas of blown glass, metals, even making some transparencies with the wood
Yeah.
to integrate with what you've already got, which is really fabulous. And I just have to say this, I love the idea of precision tools and advanced technology in the hands of an artist.
Thank
I think you should never be ashamed of that. It's a battle I've been fighting with my fashionista fashion friends
Yeah.
who are, you know, they're wedded to the idea of the petit main, sewing every feather on by hand. It's like, get a tool.
Yeah.
Do something even more better.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
don't feel shy about that. It's a wonderful thing.
Yeah. I feel like you've always got to like embrace those tools.
And you
And
can
it
maintain the tradition.
exactly. Yep.
More creative freedom and more functionality, more iterations that you can experiment with.
Yeah. I think even Wendell Castle at the end of his life, he had like a carving robot that he was starting to work with too. And I think like you mentioned, he was pushing what he could do experimentally with like these new forms and things.
How do you market yourself? So I have your card.
Yeah.
So you have a website,
Yeah, I've got a
and
website.
then your Patreon, your videos are sponsored.
Yeah, I've been starting to put like videos on there just for the people who subscribe to that. And then I try and apply to gallery shows. Like I just had the chair piece. I got into a jury show out in Philadelphia. And just trying to a lot of just networking, trying to get in with galleries and like museum shows and like applying to like residencies. So it's a lot of just casting my net out into the
And
art world.
it's crowdsourcing. I mean, is that Patreon sort of a bit?
Yeah, it's kind of like a crowdsourcing, and I do like a lot of the local art markets and like the fine furnishing show. I found also too, another thing, I really love Rhode Island a lot. One, just because it's Rhode Island, you're close to the beach, you get all this great landscape. But I've realized like being in New England in general, it really feels like people here, I think probably just because of the history of New England and like the handmade and like the history of craft here, people really embrace handmade things, which I found. And like all the art markets I do, a lot of those like bowls and dishes, the smaller things, people love buying those, which help like fund my studio process too. So it's a lot of like doing art markets, and selling like the smaller objects and like doing commission pieces and things. Yeah.
Have you ever tried using wood dyes and actually dyeing the individual blocks before assembly?
I've thought about it. I just never have done it to like dye.
Some really interesting variations of color,
Yeah.
especially like your geo type creations.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I should just do that at some point, just experiment with it.
wood dyes are fairly easy to use.
Hmm. Yeah.
I have a theory that what we all have in common is we've all made a chop saw stand.
Yeah.
That we
I
all
bought
kind
mine.
of love making shop furniture. It's like the easy side of it. There's
Yeah.
no taste involved. But what about but you're a fine artist. So how about you? Have you made a chop saw stand and have you done like shop furniture or anything like that?
Yeah, I would say I've done like chop saw stand. And it's funny because in my studio, I feel like I am very practical as like the setting up my shop. Like
Right.
I make like the most simple like utilitarian things for that so I can get like the job done. And sometimes I sit in my studio, I'm like, man, I could make a really fancy this or that for that. And I was like, no, I gotta save my time and spend it on these other things. So yeah, there's definitely that side of me too, of like just make the things in my shop so they could serve their purpose to make these other things. So yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
So what variety of different sanding tools do you use to do this beside that?
Yeah. I have a lot of like air power, like pneumatic sanders have been helpful. A lot of like die grinders. Like I have like a right angle die grinder that I could put like little 1 inch, 2 inch, and like 3 inch like sanding pads. I think they're made for automotive.
Yeah.
Is how I found them first. But those are really helpful for getting in those like small, tight spaces. Every type of little Dremel attachment I can find, I have. When Arbor Tech started making stuff, like that really opened up. That was another thing too, like I had mentioned earlier in my talk with like Instagram when I started this stuff, like the sharing of all the knowledge and stuff wasn't happening as much as it is now. And I don't think the variety of tools necessarily existed, or it was so hard to find them, or you really had to like, it was like maybe some obscure Australian brand and you had to like still dig around to find how to order a tool. But now that stuff is like, I feel like they're making things specifically for woodworkers who like, oh yeah, like wood carving has become such a big thing, especially with chainsaw carving too. I feel like that's grown a lot. So the technology, even with the tools, have really advanced, which has helped me too. So I'm always like seeking out sanders. I feel like are always the tool. I'm looking for like the newest sander to help get into those curves. But yeah, a lot of the air powered sanders, the palm sanders. I'm trying to think of any other ones that I have.
You used a ribbon sander?
Is that like the real thin one? Yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah, I have one of those.
I
Yeah,
thought you could reach in with that.
yeah, reach in with it and like still get like the little curves. Yep. Yeah, and then like you said, trusty old hand comes in at the end.